this week, changing it up a little bit again. So we're back in the circle track world. You have seen me do a couple shorts on quick change rear ends, talking about kind of in general how they work, and then another one on like how you calculate the actual rear end gear ratio when you're doing that. So those are a couple of things that we've done with this. But now we're in the off season. This is the rear end out of Eugene's car. The 27 limited late model that we run. I think the plan is to run Anderson for the most part this year. Dad and I go through these things for him every so often whenever he tells us to. Basically, there's a few things that need to check in them. There's a couple springs that need to be changed every so often. And we'll dig into all of that this week. So let's get in here. Let's start tearing this rear end down. Let's go ahead and get it into all its pieces and kind of see how it goes together, how it comes apart, and then we'll put it all back together after we do a little service work to it. So, welcome to Shift Points. Now the first thing we do when we start taking one of these apart, Eugene usually drains them, but he didn't get it drained out for us ahead of time. So we actually pulled the back cover off. And that is where the gears are housed. We'll pull that all the way off here in a minute. But you can see there's a pattern of nuts that goes on the back of that. And we just pulled that cover out a little and got it to where it would drain into a bucket. You can see it's still dripping some. We've got some paper towels there in the floor. That's kind of the first step, is to get this thing drained. There is a baffle that sits on this side of this axle housing, of course, because these cars are going to the left, therefore all the fluid wants to go to the right hand side. So there's a baffle in here that keeps the fluid from getting out into this part of the axle tube, but there's not one on this side. So whenever we drain these, we will kind of put them on jack stands and pick this side up to make sure anything that's in this axle tube drains out too. Before we stand this rear end up, the first thing we really need to do to kind of shed some weight and get it out of our way, we're going to pull the axles out of this. This is a full floating rear end. So we pull these end caps off the end of this, and that'll let us get access to the axles, and we can pull them out of each side. And like I said, just kind of get them out of our way. We'll set them off to the side while we do this work. They take safety wire and wire in these bolts here that hold this retention cap on. We'll go ahead and cut that safety wire out, get these bolts out. This cap has some like RTV silicone type stuff that keeps that sealed good. So we'll pop that cap off, and that'll let us pull the axle out. So that's what I'm going to do here. Just go ahead and cut these loose with some side cutters, theoretically. Alright, so these steels are like a modular deal, and I'll show you all the pieces when we get it turned up. But what we're going to do now is it's a lot easier to work on this with it standing up. So we'll go ahead, we've got an old wheel and tire that we use for this. We just put it onto the lug studs, kind of just hand by hand, loose bolted up. And then we'll just turn this thing up to where it's standing straight up and down. There we go. So like I said, these things are kind of a modular deal. You've got this tube out of the bell, and then you have the center section here, and then the same deal over here. This thing, the center section that we're going to be working on, the ratchet that's in here comes out in this direction. So we got that bell off. Here's all the guts, the internals here, ring gear, pinion, and this is what we've got to pull out. We got to get this ring gear and this locker assembly out of here, and that's what we're going to be working on once we get this center section pulled off, which is the same deal. It just needs to be pulled up, taken out. So now we got to take that ring gear assembly, the locker assembly, we got to take it apart. Dad puts that over in the lathe and just apply some pressure. So you got to take each one of these bolts out, and that's what's going to let us get to this he puts it in the lathe and puts some pressure on it to keep this clamped together so it's a little more controlled. There's two big springs in here, so this is sprung, so whenever you start taking these loose, that's going to try and expand. But he uses the tailstock and the head here to lock it, and then once we get everything loose, we can just ease that tailstock back, and it really controlledly opens this so we don't have to deal with it trying to spring apart after we take them bolts out. Ooh, there you go. Potentially a little more controlled than that normally.
It fell out.
There you go. So, like I said, it's a little less controlled than normal, but pretty good.
This is a ratchet, and if you run these springs a little bit too long, or just run the whole assembly a little bit too long, it'll knock these corners. These edges will get radius. They'll get round on the two parts of this locker, and it'll start rolling over real easy. When this locks up, it applies torque to both rear tires, and when it unloads around the corner, when you lift off the throttle and unloads, it kicks over across the top of them and allows the inside wheel to run at a different speed than the outside, so it can freewheel around the corners. And when you mash the gas again, this engages, and the springs keep tension on all the time. There's a spring. These springs sit like this against this. It's grooved right here. The spring sits inside it, and there's one on each side, so it keeps some pressure against these all the time. So if you let these get worn and collapsed, and the tension goes out of them, it'll start letting those disengage when it shouldn't be disengaged, and that'll wear the locker out, and of course the springs are already killed. So it's a good idea. According to Tiger, they've got a maintenance schedule to replace the springs, and then at least inspect the ratchet, the locker, at a certain frequency. So that's kind of what goes on here. But these are in good shape. I think there's only about 2 races, maybe a couple hundred laps, something like that on them. So everything's in pretty good shape. We'll just replace these springs and put everything back together, and we'll be good for a race or two anyway.
So basically one of the hardest parts about this is this reassembly process. And it's not that it's hard, it's really just tedious. And we've tried it in a handful of different ways throughout the past few years of working on these, and we found the best way to do it is using a drill press. So we tried it the first time using a lathe that had everything laid horizontal, and with all these components you've got to get them all basically lined up perfectly so that it'll all go back together smoothly and everything will be where it needs to be. So the drill press gives us control because we can use the head of the drill press to apply pressure and collapse that whole assembly and get it lined up, and it's just a lot easier to do. So that's what we'll do here. So you can see Dad runs the bed of the drill press up initially and then locks it down, and then at that point I hold this, make sure everything kind of stays square. Or not square. And then we put some pressure on it with the head of the drill press. Dang.
Now is the LP lined up?
It is, yeah.
It is?
Yeah.
There's a couple of bumpers too.
Okay. Okay.
What is it?
I didn't have the camera.
It always does that.
Alright, so you guys did kind of miss it a little, but we finally got everything lined up and we got this seated in place where it needed to be. Now we're just taking some bolts, just running them down in here, keep everything clamped up. But you can see even what part I did film, kind of how tedious it is to get everything lined up, and then it seems just like magic. All of a sudden it'll it'll all just line up exactly how it's supposed to. Now we'll just go ahead and put all these bolts back in place and get them tightened down and torqued down. and this thing will be ready to go back together. So there isn't a torque spec called out for these bolts, but we do like to keep them all the same. Dad just kind of looked up a generic torque spec, so we're going to run these all down to the same. It's only 15 foot-pounds, which is pretty light, but we want to do this in somewhat of a crisscross pattern. Make sure this is bolted down good, and we won't have any issues here. So when Dad first started working on these for Eugene and Mitch, whenever they first approached him about kind of figuring these out because he had never done it before, one question that he had was, how much torque does it take to actually cause that locker inside of this assembly to ratchet? When he spoke with Tiger, it was something that they had never actually had ever measured. When he spoke to them and they mentioned that to him, he said, well, we've never really measured that. And so Dad came up with this fixture as a way to kind of to test this. It's more of a gut check, basically, I would say, more than anything. So those springs, over time, they wear out. With these purple springs, it says to change them every 4 to 5 races. I was looking at the Tiger book here so that I told you the right thing. Every 4 to 5 races, you're supposed to change those springs so that that ratchet works properly, like Dad talked about earlier in the video. So when he first took this apart, and we should have done this in this video, we should have checked what this assembly torqued at, whenever it first came out of the rear end before we changed the springs. But we've got some notes in our books and we'll run those past you. But let me show you what it's doing. So basically he took this axle in and welded it to this plate that goes into the vise, and you can actually put the locker assembly down on this, and this simulates an axle being in this locker assembly. And then he took another end here and an axle end that he can put in here, and it simulates another axle being in here, and this has a half inch extension that he's cut off and put in here. And what he can do is he can take his torque wrench and put in here, so to basically ratchet this rear end, and it'll give you a torque reading. These new springs, we'll see what this torque's at, and we'll check our notes and see what the we had one of these that came in here at one point. It wore completely out. Ratchet was wore and everything. And the other thing that this does, really more than telling you about the springs, is if that ratchet is wore, it'll basically ratchet a lot easier. A lot less torque is needed to ratchet it than if it's a new good one. And we know that this one is new and good, so it's going to give us a good example. And then we'll dig into the notes and see what one that's completely wore out ratchets at. And it's just an interesting little deal. Dad's always thinking about stuff like this, trying to come up with ways to measure and check stuff so that, over time, when stuff comes back in, you know where it was when it left the shop, and you know where it is when it came back in. So it takes just under 40 foot-pounds for that to ratchet that center section, that assembly inside there. And then let's look at our notes here and see what one that came in here at one point that was completely wore out were. So looking back at the notes, the last time that this thing came in here and it was wore out, it had these issues and actually wore out. The foot-pounds on that was about like 18 to 20, somewhere in that range. And so you can see how much, the difference is. It was half of what basically a brand new good set is. So again, when you take this out, if you bring this back in here, before we even take it apart, we can do it like this, and gives us a good idea, okay, there's something going on here. We knew that this one was ready for a freshen up anyway, so that's why we didn't do this to begin with those springs. But in general, like I said, this is just something that Dad has done to try and give us some documentation, because he even has this notebook here where he has basically a history of what he's done to this rear end, the times that it's been in here, what it was when it left, and then we know. It's really good to log stuff like this in racing. Anything that you can document, especially, honestly with anything, but in racing it's especially important. It just helps make everyone's life easier in knowing that things are how they're supposed to be. So one thing we do, I didn't show you, but I just cleaned these bells off. They have we run a Permatex RTV like black silicone on that to seal everything up good. It does have O-rings in here. Those laying there pretty flat, you can see. So we just take a putty knife and scrape all that off, get it cleaned up. We do that for the center section as well. This magnesium case kind of has this little bit of coating here, so we keep it clean and just get it scraped off good. So that'll be ready to go back together. We did wipe out the excess oil that was down here that was pretty grimy and gross. You can see all that there. And so now we're basically at the point here, we'll wipe this out a little bit more, and we're ready to go ahead, put the locker assembly back into the bell here, and then we can put our center section back on and just start the whole reassembly process. So the last thing that we do here on reassembly is we have an actual torque spec called out on these bell bolts. It's 40 foot-pounds, so Dad's got the torque wrench here. We usually go to 30, and then step up to 40. So we'll kind of go across this in somewhat of a crisscross pattern. I took the gun and just ran these down to the first click, just so that everything was seated and everything's ready to go. The name Quick Change isn't just a clever name, so it came because of basically what it is. These rear ends have a gear set in them, this one right here in particular, and basically what you do to change your gear ratio in the rear end, that's why these are so popular in like land speed racing and circle track racing, is you can quickly make these changes to your rear end ratio. So you guys saw it while this was apart. This thing has a ring gear and a pinion in here that has a set gear ratio. For this one it's a 412, and so basically you can go in here and change this gear set. Yes, you do have to change both of them, but based off the number of teeth and the diameters and stuff, the gear sets are a set, so you have to change each one of them. I made a short on those at one point, and a lot of people gave me a hard time because I only gave an example of changing one, because I was just showing it coming on and off. But yes, you do absolutely have to change both of them to change your gear ratio. So it is literally this easy. You can pull this gear off right here, pull the other gear off, and grab another gear set and put a new one on. Big gear goes on top. Well, that's true. So normally, big gear would go on top, I will say, in most circle track. Now, if you're land speed racing and you need a gear that's going to let you go real long, you can change it. You might be able to make that swap and change it. It's completely dependent on what you're doing. To basically get your final drive ratio, you're going to take your big gear, so it's a 22, and divide it by your small gear, it's a 16. That gives you 1.375, and then take that number and multiply it by your 412. It gives you a 566 gear. That's what's in this. That's not what's going to go in it out the door. I haven't even checked the gear set that's going in it. We are going to make a change to it to get ready for the season. But that's how you do your quick change math. It's literally that simple. Take your top gear, divide it by your bottom gear, and then multiply it by either the 411 or 412. This one's a 412, but they can also be 411. So on top of having these different size gears, if you run this in a 1-to-1, so if you run like a 28 and a 28 or whatever that ends up being, that would make this a 411. So it would go back to what it goes to 1-to-1 to what the actual ring gear and pinion is. You can make some fine-tune adjustments depending on, like for us, you've got racetracks that are 4/10 of a mile. You've got some that are 3/8 of a mile. You need to get your engine, and especially if you're running like a crate engine, like this class that we run, you have a pretty tight window of RPM that you want to try and keep your engine in, and this is going to help you do that to the best of your ability.
We have put one of these rear ends in a street car, the big one with the big ring gear and pinion. They make a smaller diameter deal, which won't handle as much horsepower, but every component's lighter. It's easier to rotate. But if you put one of these things on the street, there's companies that make these gears that's helical cut. In other words, they're cut on an angle. Well, these are straight cut. These straight cut gears are extremely noisy, which you're not really concerned with that in a circle track car or any kind of race application, but if you put it on the street, it will really cut down on it. But if you look back before we set this bell on and notice where the pinion engages in the ring gear, the hypoid offset is almost 1-to-1. It's almost in the center. The pinion is almost in the center of the ring gear. That makes it noisy too, because it's not got a lot of tooth contact, where like a 9-inch Ford is the opposite end of that. The pinion comes in at the bottom and attaches way off the center line of the ring gear. That keeps more surface of the teeth engaged, which makes it quieter. It also makes it some stronger. But these things they're trying to get as much horsepower to the ground as they can, and that's the reason the pinion rides pretty close to the center of the ring gear. They call it hypoid offset. So they're noisy. They're not super tough like a 9-inch. As far as somebody might correct me on that if I'm wrong, but these are not. They won't handle the horsepower, especially in a drag race application. Circle track stuff's not really hammering, hitting it real hard, leaving. But for what they're designed for, they're a really extremely good, extremely handy piece.
All right, last step is get the axles put back in place. This has the one with the baffle in it. It's not terribly hard, but it's just kind of time consuming. These end plate caps, they also get that RTV on them, so you got to get the old off. Same thing for the face of the hub here. It has the RTV on it, so it just takes some time to go around and get all this kind of scraped off and get ready to put the old back on. We'll put a thin layer on this cap, bolt it back up, and we'll have this thing wrapped up. All right, guys, Dad's gonna button up putting those end caps on, and that'll have this thing completely sealed up and ready to go. Just like every week here on Shift Points, you never know what we're going to get into. This week is circle track. Hopefully, next week we're back on the 55 again. So that's the plan. We'll get back on that and try and get that thing done and ready as soon as possible. So we appreciate you guys for watching. Hope you learned something. Hope you have a quick change. You learned a little something about that quick change. And if you know now, you can kind of use this as a guide to help you go through them a little bit if you need to. At least know you don't have to be afraid. You can take one of these things apart and you can work your way back through it if you got the right stuff. We appreciate you guys. Hit that subscribe button. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, all social medias, and we will see you next week.